The letter arrived at the Sweetwater Creek post office on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and Clyde Walden had only read as far as the third paragraph before he pushed back his chair, folded the paper carefully along its worn creases, and began saddling his horse. He had not even read to the end of it. He did not need to. Something in those 3 paragraphs had reached inside his chest and rearranged everything that had been quietly broken there for the better part of a decade. The letter had come through the Matrimonial Gazette, a small publication that circulated through the territories, connecting lonely people in lonely places with other lonely people in other lonely places. His sister, Ruth, had placed the subscription on his behalf without asking him first, and he had tolerated it the way he tolerated most things his sister did, with a long exhale through his nose and a silent acknowledgement that she was probably right about him. He had received 7 letters before Ellen Abbott's. 7 letters from women who described themselves as cheerful or industrious or devout or skilled at preserving fruit. They had been perfectly adequate letters from what he presumed were perfectly adequate women, and he had written back to 2 of them, and the correspondence had died naturally, like embers in morning rain. There had been no cruelty in it, no hard feelings. Just 2 people recognizing, through the strange medium of ink and paper, that the space between them was too vast to cross. But Ellen Abbott's letter was different from the very first line. She had written, "I am going to tell you the truth because I have spent 17 years not doing that, and I am tired down to my bones of it." He had sat up straighter when he read that. She had written that she was 38 years old and plain and tired of pretending otherwise. She had written that she had been married before, to a man named Gerald Abbott who had died of a fever 3 winters past, and that their marriage had been civil and functional and largely devoid of warmth, and that she was not looking for someone to repeat that particular arrangement. She had written that she lived on a small farm outside the town of Red Bluff, in the Nevada Territory, and that the farm produced enough to sustain her, but not enough to make her anything other than tired at the end of each day. She had written that she had no children, which she had made her peace with some years ago, though the peace was of the fragile, provisional sort that required daily tending. She had written that she was not looking for rescue. She was looking for honesty. She was looking for a man who would sit across a table from her in the morning and say what he actually thought about the day ahead rather than what he imagined she wanted to hear. She was looking for someone who was not afraid of silence and who was not afraid of hard work, and who understood that 40 was coming for both of them like a freight train whether they liked it or not, and it seemed a shame to face it alone if you did not have to. She had signed it, Ellen Abbott, Red Bluff, Nevada Territory. 38 years old, plain, and hoping you are not frightened by either of those facts. Clyde Walden was 41 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch, and had the kind of face that the sun had worked on considerably creased around the eyes, weathered along the jaw, with a nose that had been broken once in a disagreement over water rights, and had healed slightly to the left of where it had begun. He was not a handsome man in the way that the dime novels described handsome men, but he was a man who had been described as steady and capable and good, and those were the words that had followed him through his life like faithful dogs. He owned a cattle ranch outside Sweetwater Creek in the Arizona Territory. It was 740 acres of decent grazing land with a creek that ran reliably through the dry months, and a house that had 4 rooms and a good stone fireplace, and a porch that faced west so you could watch the sky turn colors in the evening. He had built most of it himself. He had 2 ranch hands, a man named Domingo Torres who had worked for him for 6 years, and a young man named Billy Fitch who had shown up one spring looking for work and had proved himself worth keeping. He had never been married. This was not for lack of opportunity exactly, but for lack of the particular kind of courage it required. He had been engaged once to a woman named Clara Marsh, back when he was 29 and full of the idea that he knew what he wanted. Clara had been beautiful and quick-tempered and had eventually chosen a banker in Tucson over Clyde, and he could not honestly say she had made the wrong choice. He was better suited to the land than to the parlor, and they had both known it. After Clara, he had simply put his head down and worked. The ranch had grown. The house had taken shape. The years had passed with the particular velocity that years acquire when you are not watching them closely. And then one morning he had stood at his own kitchen window with a cup of coffee and noticed that the gray at his temples had become the predominant color, and that the silence of the house, which had once felt like peace, had started to feel like something else entirely. That was when Ruth had sent in his subscription to the Matrimonial Gazette without asking. And now he had this letter on the kitchen table in front of him, and outside the window the spring morning was the color of new brass, and he had read 3 paragraphs, and already he understood something about Ellen Abbott that he could not have articulated precisely, but that he felt with absolute certainty. She was real, in a way that very few people were real to him in print. She was present on the page in the way that the desert was present, without ornamentation, without apology, with a kind of spare and uncompromising beauty that required you to look at it directly. He saddled his horse, not because he was going anywhere yet. Red Bluff was a solid 2 days' ride from Sweetwater Creek, or better, reached by the stage that ran through Prescott and then north. He was not the kind of man who made decisions in the grip of feeling without any practicality attached. But he saddled his horse because he needed to do something with the energy that had arrived in him along with those 3 paragraphs, and because saddling a horse was a thing he could do without having to explain himself to anyone. He rode out to the north pasture and checked the fence line and thought about it. He thought about her phrase, "tired down to my bones of it." He knew that tiredness. He knew it in a way that did not have anything to do with physical labor, though he had certainly done enough of that. It was the tiredness of performing a version of yourself that was slightly off from the true one, day after day, year after year, until you could not quite remember where the performance ended and you began. He turned his horse back toward the ranch house at mid-morning and sat down and read the rest of the letter. The rest of it was more practical. She described the farm in careful detail, the acreage, the soil quality, the small herd of 8 cattle that she managed alone, the kitchen garden that she depended on through winter. She described her daily routine with the same matter-of-fact precision, and there was something in the way she described hard work, not as complaint, but as simple inventory, that made him feel she was someone who had looked her life squarely in the face and had chosen to continue it without the softening of illusion. She noted at the end that she was not asking him to come to Nevada. She was placing the letter with the Gazette, and if a man responded and they corresponded for a time and something developed naturally, she would welcome that. She was not, she wrote, the sort of person who expected a man to upend his life on the basis of 3 letters and a feeling. She had simply wanted to be honest because she was tired of being otherwise. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down and wrote his reply. He had never been a skilled writer of letters. His sentences tended toward the functional and brief, in the way that a fence post was functional and brief. But he wrote to Ellen Abbott with an attentiveness that surprised him. He wrote about the ranch, about the 740 acres and the creek and the porch that faced west. He wrote about Clara Marsh briefly, because she had been honest with him, and it seemed only right to return that honesty. He wrote that he was 41, and that the gray had taken over his temples entirely, and that his nose had been broken and had not healed straight. He wrote that he had read her first line, "I am going to tell you the truth because I have spent 17 years not doing that," and had understood something in it that he could not explain in writing, but that had made him get up from the table and go outside. He did not tell her he had saddled the horse. That seemed like the kind of thing you said in person or not at all. He sealed the letter and rode to town and posted it that same afternoon. The reply came 11 days later. 11 days that Clyde Walden experienced as a kind of heightened waiting he had not felt since boyhood, aware of the passage of each day in a way he had not been for years, aware of the horse making its way to town and back, aware of the particular quality of his own anticipation. Ellen's second letter was shorter than the first, but more personal. She thanked him for his honesty about Clara Marsh. She said that she appreciated a man who could discuss a former love without either bitterness or excessive sentimentality. She wrote about Red Bluff, the small town, the general store run by a man named Hayes who she described as the primary source of local gossip, the church she attended on Sundays without a great deal of conviction, but with a firm commitment to the social function it served. She wrote about her neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Cordelia Marsh, no relation to Clara, she noted with what Clyde recognized as dry humor, who had been the closest thing Ellen had to a friend in the years since Gerald's death. She wrote near the end, "I find I am looking forward to your letters in a way I did not expect. I want to be careful with that feeling because it is still very new, like something that has not had time to prove whether it is sturdy or not. But I wanted you to know it was there." He read that paragraph 4 times. He wrote back the same day. Then he made himself wait 2 days before posting it, on the theory that mailing a letter the same day it was written was the behavior of a man who had lost his perspective entirely, and he was not that man. He was not entirely sure that was true anymore, but he maintained the pretense. The letters continued through April and into May. They wrote about practical things, the price of cattle, the difficulty of finding reliable water in the Nevada dry season, a storm that had passed through the Arizona territory in early May and had taken down a section of fence that cost Clyde 3 days of hard repair work. They wrote about less practical things, the books they had each read, though Ellen had read considerably more than Clyde, which she noted without condescension and which he appreciated. They wrote about their families, his sister Ruth and her husband Ben and their 3 children in Prescott, her brother Thomas in Ohio who wrote once a year at Christmas with letters that were, in Ellen's description, aggressively cheerful in the way of people who are not entirely certain their cheerfulness is warranted. And slowly, with the careful accumulation of detail that only letters can build, they began to know each other. Not perfectly, not completely, but in the honest way of people who have agreed to stop pretending. He told her about the years after Clara. She told him about the years with Gerald, the way their marriage had been cordial and distant in the manner of 2 people sharing a space they had not chosen together, the way Gerald's death had produced grief that was real but also complicated, tangled up with guilt about the relief that had moved underneath the grief like a current. He wrote back that he thought guilt about complicated feelings was itself a kind of honesty, and that she should not mistake the complexity of her grief for inadequacy as a wife or a woman. She wrote back, "That is possibly the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. It made me cry, which I am mentioning only because I want you to know the letter had its intended effect." He laughed when he read that. Not a polite laugh, but a real one, the kind that started in the chest. He was standing at the kitchen window again, coffee in hand, and Domingo Torres was crossing the yard outside and looked up at the unfamiliar sound of his employer's laughter and gave Clyde a sideways look that was equal parts curiosity and satisfaction. By June, Clyde had decided to go to Red Bluff. He had not told Ellen this yet. He was working out the logistics Billy Fitch and Domingo could manage the ranch for 2 weeks, possibly 3. The stage from Sweetwater Creek to Prescott, and then the northbound line through the territory, ran on a schedule he had now memorized. He had the money for the fare. He had, if he was being honest with himself, been thinking about very little else for the better part of 2 months. He wrote to Ellen in the first week of June and asked whether it would be appropriate for him to visit Red Bluff. He tried to write the letter in a way that was direct without being presumptuous, honest without being alarming. He wrote that he had valued their correspondence enormously and that he found himself wanting to know whether the person on the page matched the person in life and whether she might be interested in finding out the same thing about him. He added at the end, "I want to be clear that I am not coming to propose anything or to make any demands on your time or your hospitality. I am coming because I would like to meet you. That is the whole of it. He posted it and waited. Her reply arrived 8 days later and was, by Ellen Abbott's standards, brief. It read, "Yes, come." He told Billy Fitch and Domingo Torres on a Monday morning. Domingo nodded in the way he nodded when Clyde said things that Domingo had been expecting him to say for some time. Billy Fitch, who was 23 and enthusiastic about most things, asked approximately 14 questions about the woman, and whether she was pretty and whether Clyde thought this might lead to something serious. And Clyde answered approximately 2 of them and let the rest dissolve into the morning air. He packed a bag on the Wednesday evening, with a care he would not ordinarily have applied to the process of packing. He examined his good shirt, the blue one with the buttons that had not been replaced yet and needed to be. He noted and sewed the loose button himself rather than leave it. He polished his boots. He combed his hair in the small mirror above the washstand and looked at his face with the critical attention that he rarely brought to it, and saw what he expected to see. A man of 41 who had spent most of his life outdoors, and who was not going to become a different sort of face before Thursday morning. He left on the Thursday stage. The journey took parts of 2 days. The stage from Sweetwater Creek connected to the main line at a depot 20 miles north, and from there the route ran through the high desert with the particular relentless beauty of that country, the rust and ochre of the mesa walls, the scrub and sage, the enormous sky that made everything moving beneath it seem both small and significant at once. He sat by the window and watched it go past and thought about Ellen Abbott. He thought about her phrase, plain. He thought about the specific quality of someone who described themselves that way, not beautiful, not handsome, not anything that made people turn in the street, but present, real, there in the way that good, solid things were there. He thought that he had known beautiful women, and that beauty was a wonderful thing, but that it was not the only thing, and was possibly not even the most important thing, and that what he was looking for, what he had perhaps been looking for a long time without knowing the name of it, was someone who was present in the room in the way that Ellen Abbott was present on the page. He arrived in Red Bluff on a Friday afternoon in the second week of June, 1882. Red Bluff was smaller than Sweetwater Creek, maybe 300 people, with a single main street that had a general store, a saloon, a small hotel called the Bluff House, a livery stable, a post office that also served as the telegraph office, and the church Ellen had mentioned in her letters. There was a dusty, sun-baked quality to it that was common to towns of that size in that territory, hardy and a little stubborn, not pretty, but solid in the way of things that had been built to last rather than to impress. He checked into the Bluff House and washed the road off his face and changed his shirt, the blue one, the button now secure, and asked the man at the desk for directions to the Abbott farm. The desk clerk, a short man with an impressive mustache, looked at him with the particular interest of a man in a small town who processes new arrivals as the primary entertainment of his working day. "You know Mrs. Abbott?" the clerk asked. "I'm hoping to," Clyde said. The clerk gave him the directions without further interrogation, though Clyde could feel the man watching him as he left. The Abbott farm was a mile and a half east of town, off a dirt track that wound past a stand of cottonwood trees and then opened onto a flat parcel of land that was, in the late afternoon light, quietly lovely in the way of places that do not call attention to themselves. There was a small adobe house with a covered porch and a kitchen garden alongside it, well tended, the rows straight, and the soil dark. There was a barn and a corral with 4 horses and a small herd of cattle in the back pasture. The creek that Ellen had mentioned ran along the property's northern edge, and there were willows along it, their long fingers trailing in the current. He stopped his horse at the gate. His heart was doing something it had not done in a considerable number of years, which was beating with an urgency that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Ellen Abbott was in the kitchen garden. He could see her from the gate, a woman in a brown work dress and a wide-brimmed hat, kneeling in the dirt among the tomato plants, her back to him. She was not small, he noticed, and not frail. There was a solidity to her that spoke of years of physical work, a capable quality to her posture even when she was kneeling. Her hair, where it was visible beneath the hat, was dark with threads of gray. He opened the gate and rode to the edge of the garden and dismounted, and she must have heard the horse because she stood and turned, and he saw her face for the first time. She was, as she had described, plain. Not unattractive, not at all, but without the striking symmetry or theatrical beauty of a woman who would be described as a great beauty. She had a strong face, wide cheekbones, dark eyes that were direct and serious, and at this moment somewhat large with an emotion he recognized, because he was feeling the same one. She had lines around her eyes that came from squinting in bright sun and from, he suspected, a fair amount of laughter, and her mouth was full and firm, and set in an expression of wariness that he understood completely. They looked at each other for a moment across the kitchen garden. "You must be Clyde Walden," she said. Her voice was steady and low. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "And you must be Ellen Abbott." She pulled off her gardening gloves and tucked them into her apron pocket. There was dirt on her hands and on one cheek, and she did not appear to notice or care about either. "You came," she said. "I did," he said. She looked at him steadily for another moment. "The letter I wrote. Was it really as forthright as I remember it being? Because I have lain awake some nights since and thought maybe I was too forthright, too much all at once." "No," he said. "It was exactly right. It was the realest thing I had read in longer than I can easily account for." Something shifted in her expression then, not quite a smile, but the antechamber of one. "Well," she said, "I expect you are hungry after the road. Come inside." He tied his horse at the post and followed her in. The inside of the house was like the garden, unpretentious and well-ordered, with a clean practicality to it. The kitchen was large and well-stocked, the table solid oak and worn smooth at the edges. There was a shelf of books along one wall of the sitting room, considerably more books than he had expected, and he found himself reading the spines as she put the kettle on. Dickens, George Eliot, a well-worn Bible, several volumes whose titles he could not make out at this distance. She set coffee and cornbread on the table and sat across from him, and for the first time he fully appreciated the strangeness and the rightness of this situation. That they had said so much to each other in letters, and had never been in the same room, and that being in the same room was both entirely different from and entirely consistent with what those letters had built. "I was nervous," she said without preamble. "I want to say that I am still nervous. I thought I should mention it because I said in my first letter that I was done pretending, and pretending I am not nervous would be the very first order of pretense, and I would rather not start there. I was nervous on the stage," he said. "I was nervous when I saw you in the garden. I'm somewhat less nervous now, sitting at your table." She looked at him with her direct, serious eyes. "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because you are the same in person as you are in the letters. I was afraid you would not be." She was quiet for a moment. "And what does the same mean in this case?" "Real," he said. "Present, not performing anything for my benefit." She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him, and this time it was not the antechamber of a smile but the smile itself, and it changed her face considerably, warmed it from within like a lamp turned up in a dim room. "I left the hotel after dinner last night," she said, "which is the only time I have ever done such a thing in my life. I sat on the porch and told myself that whatever you were like in person, I had already told you more truth in those letters than I had told most people in my whole life, and that I ought to be comfortable with whatever happened next. But I was not." "What were you afraid of?" he asked. "That you would be disappointed," she said, simply and without drama. "I described myself honestly, and I meant every word of it. But there is a difference between reading the description and encountering the fact, and I was not entirely certain the fact would hold up." He looked at her across the table in the late afternoon light that came through the kitchen window and fell across the oak grain and the coffee cups and the rough beauty of her strong, plain face. "Mrs. Abbott," he said, "I am not disappointed." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Neither am I," she said. "He stayed in Red Bluff for 12 days. He slept at the Bluff House and took his meals sometimes there, and sometimes at Ellen's kitchen table. And they talked. They talked in the way that people who have already told the important truths by letter can talk, without the preliminary negotiations of new acquaintance, moving directly into the substance of things. They talked about the ranch and the farm, and about cattle prices and water law, and the increasing encroachment of the railroads on the old ways of moving cattle. They talked about books. She had read considerably more than he had, but was not in the least condescending about it, and she seemed genuinely interested in the things he had to say about the land and the work and the years that were embedded in him like rings in a tree. They rode out together on the second day, across her land and then north along the creek, and she was a competent rider, easy in the saddle in the way of someone who had been on horseback since childhood. The Nevada territory was different from his Arizona flatter in some places, with a different quality to the silence, drier and more vast in its openness. She showed him the places she loved: a bend in the creek where cottonwoods made shade in summer, a rise in the land to the north from which you could see for 40 miles on a clear morning. She was good company in the outdoors. She was not a talker for the sake of talking. She had, as she had advertised in her letters, no difficulty with silence, and they rode sometimes for long stretches without words, and the silence was comfortable between them in the way that silence is only comfortable between people who have found a rhythm together. On the fourth day, he helped her mend a section of fence along the pasture's eastern edge. It was practical work that required no discussion, and they worked side by side through the morning heat without ceremony, and it felt, to Clyde, like one of the more natural things he had done in years. When they broke for water at mid-morning, Ellen poured from the canteen and handed it to him first, and their fingers brushed, and neither of them made anything of it except that both of them were aware of it for the rest of the afternoon. On the fifth evening, they sat on her porch after dinner and watched the western sky perform its nightly theater, and he told her about the day he had read her letter. He told her about the third paragraph in the phrase "tired down to my bones" and about getting up from the table and going outside. "I saddled my horse," he said, "before I had finished reading." She turned to look at him. "Before you finished it. I got to the part where you said you were tired of pretending and I had to do something, and saddling the horse was the nearest useful thing." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the orange and purple dissolution of the sunset. "What did you do with the horse?" "Rode the fence line," he said. "Came back and read the rest." She made a small sound that was half laugh and half something more tender. "Clyde Walden," she said. "You are a strange and straightforward man." "I am aware of both of those things," he said. She looked back at the sky. "I am glad you wrote back," she said. "I am glad I was honest in that letter. I was not certain I would be, right up until I sent it. I sat with it in my hand at the post office for a long time before I put it in." "What made you put it in?" She was quiet for a moment. "The fact that not putting it in was the same as every other choice I had made for the past several years. And that was," she paused, choosing her word carefully, "it was sufficient, that life, but it was not what I wanted." "What do you want?" he asked. She turned to look at him directly in the fading light with those dark, serious eyes. "This," she said. "Something real, someone real." He looked back at her for a long time, and then he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, which was calloused and strong and warm, and she let him, and they sat like that until the sky went dark and the stars came out in their millions above the Nevada desert. On the seventh day of his visit, he met Mrs. Cordelia Marsh. Mrs. Marsh was 63 years old and small and ferocious, in the manner of a woman who had survived a great many things and was not impressed by much anymore. She arrived at Ellen's farm on a Tuesday morning with a jar of preserves and the transparent intention of examining the man who had arrived from Arizona and was spending a great deal of time at her friend's table. She looked Clyde up and down with the same frank appraisal she might have given a horse she was considering buying. "So you are the letter man," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Clyde said. "Ellen tells me you are a cattle rancher. 700 acres. 740. That is a respectable amount of land, she said, as though land were the primary criterion by which men should be evaluated. Then, are you a good man, Mr. Walden? I try to be, he said. I do not always succeed. Mrs. Marsh appeared to find this acceptable. At least you do not say yes without thinking about it. Gerald Abbott always said yes without thinking about anything. She said this in Ellen's presence without apparent concern for tact, and Ellen's expression suggested she was accustomed to this. I knew Gerald, Mrs. Marsh continued, pouring herself coffee without being offered it. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had no particular interest in other people, which is a deficiency that compounds over time. I hope you are not similarly afflicted. I am interested in people, Clyde said, in one particular person at present. Mrs. Marsh looked at him, then at Ellen, then back at him. She said. She drank her coffee. She ate 2 pieces of cornbread. She talked for another 40 minutes about the state of the territory, the scarcity of decent water, the inadequacy of the sheriff's office in Red Bluff, and the particular iniquity of a land speculator named Renfrew who had been attempting to purchase land from several of the smaller farmers in the area, including Ellen. He came by twice last spring, Ellen told Clyde after Mrs. Marsh had departed. Offered a fair price actually, but I was not interested in selling. He was not pleased about that. Has he come back? Clyde asked. Not recently, Ellen said, but Mrs. Marsh says he has been buying up properties south of town, and she thinks he intends to push further north when he has enough consolidated. Clyde filed this information away with the attention he gave to anything that touched Ellen Abbott's welfare, which had become, over the course of the past week, considerable. On the 9th day, they rode into town together for supplies, and he saw, for the first time, the way that Red Bluff received Ellen. She was known there in the way of a person who has been in a place long enough to be furniture present, functional, largely unremarked. The man at the general store, Hayes, was pleasant to her, but with the faint patronizing quality of a man who was not accustomed to thinking of a widow living alone as a person of particular consequence. When Ellen requested a specific grade of seed corn that Hayes did not stock, he suggested she would probably do well enough with the ordinary kind, and there was a dismissiveness in it that made Clyde quietly furious. He did not say anything. It was not his place to say anything, not yet, and possibly not in the way that would have satisfied the fury. But he watched Ellen handle it with the steady composure of a woman who had been handling it for years, and he admired her enormously for it and also felt, for the first time in the trip, the specific anger that comes from watching someone you care about be underestimated. He told her this that evening on the porch. He was direct about it because they had agreed, in the best tradition of their letters, to be direct. Hayes is a fool, he said. Ellen looked mildly startled. He is merely conventional, she said. Conventional is a word that covers a great deal of foolishness, Clyde said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read. You were angry, she said. Yes, on my behalf. Yes, he said. Is that impertinent? She was quiet for a long moment. No, she said at last softly. No, Clyde, it is not. It is. She stopped. What? I am not accustomed to it, she said. That is all. Someone being angry on my behalf. I do not quite know what to do with it. He looked at her across the porch in the evening light. You do not have to do anything with it, he said. I am just telling you. She nodded slowly, looking out at the darkening sky. On the 11th day, he asked her to come to Arizona. They were at the kitchen table, and the morning light was on the window, and she had made coffee the way he had already learned to recognize as her particular way, strong and black, and without apology. He had been turning the question over in his mind for days, examining it from every angle, trying to determine whether this was the right time, whether he was reading the situation correctly, whether his certainty was genuine or simply the hopeful confusion of a man who had been alone for too long. He had decided that the certainty was genuine. Ellen, he said. She looked up from her coffee. I want to ask you something that I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is no. She set down her cup. All right, she said. "I would like you to consider coming to the ranch," he said. "Not permanently, not yet unless you wanted that, but I would like you to see it. I would like you to meet Ruth, my sister. I would like—" He paused and said the rest of it plainly, because plainness was the only language she fully trusted. "I would like to know whether you might want to build something with me. A life. The kind where we sit across the table from each other in the morning and say what we actually think about the day." She was very still. He watched her face carefully and saw the wariness that was her default expression for new and important things, and underneath it something else, a warmth, a movement, like the creek in spring when the snow begins to melt. "That is from my first letter," she said, "what I wrote about wanting." "I remember it exactly," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "What would happen to the farm?" "That would be your decision," he said. "Entirely. It could be sold, or it could be rented out, or if you came and decided that Arizona was not for you and you wanted to come back, it would be here." "You are giving me an exit before we have even begun," she said, with a small, complicated smile. "I am giving you choices," he said, "because you are a woman who should have them." She was quiet for a moment. "I am going to need to think about this," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said. She thought about it for the rest of that day, and through the morning of the 12th day, and on the afternoon of his last day in Red Bluff she came out to where he was unsaddling his horse in preparation for the morning departure, and she stood at the corral fence and said, "Yes." He turned to look at her. "Yes," she said again. "I will come to Arizona. I want to see the ranch and meet your sister and find out whether what I believe about you is true in practice." She paused. "And I want you to know that I am not saying yes because I am afraid of being alone, or because the farm is difficult, or because of any of the practical reasons that might seem reasonable from the outside. I am saying yes because I have talked to you every day for 2 weeks and I have not yet wanted a single day to end, and that has not happened to me before, not with anyone." He came to the fence and looked at her across it. "Ellen," he said, "I intend to court you properly. I want to be clear about that. I am not in a rush. Whatever pace feels right to you is the right pace." She looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "Clyde Walden," she said, "you saddled your horse before you finished reading my first letter. I think we have both already decided where this is going." He laughed, the same real laugh that had startled Domingo Torres, the one that came from the chest. And Ellen Abbott smiled at him, a full, unhidden smile this time, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in a very long time. He left on the Thursday morning stage. She stood at the gate of the farm and watched him go, and he turned to look at her from the road and tipped his hat, and she raised one hand in farewell, and the morning light was gold on the cottonwoods and on the creek and on her strong, plain, real face. He thought, riding toward the stage depot, "I am going to marry that woman." It took Ellen 3 weeks to arrange her departure from Red Bluff. She put the farm in the hands of a rental arrangement managed by Hayes's competitor, a more competent and less condescending man named Sutter, who ran a small land management business out of his home on the edge of town. Mrs. Cordelia Marsh was characteristically direct about the whole business, declaring that she had known Ellen would not stay in Red Bluff for the rest of her life, and that it was about time, and that the Arizona man seemed acceptable. She said acceptable in the voice of someone who meant considerably more than that, and hugged Ellen with a ferocity that suggested she would miss her badly and had no intention of saying so. Ellen packed her books first, then her good dishes, the ones from her mother, then her practical things, clothes, tools, the household items that had no particular sentiment attached, but that a person needed. She sold the cattle for a fair price and kept 3 of the horses, arranging for them to be transported south by a stock man who made the Nevada to Arizona run twice a year. She wrote to Clyde throughout the preparation, and he wrote back, and the letters now had a different quality, more immediate, more present, aware of a specific and approaching future rather than the abstract possibility of one. He wrote about preparing the ranch for her arrival with a specificity that she found touching. He had had the spare room cleaned out and the window replaced where the glass had been cracked since the previous winter, and Ruth was bringing curtains for it from Prescott. She wrote back, "You did not need to prepare anything. I am not a person who requires curtains." He wrote back, "They are not for requirement, they are because you are coming." She folded that letter and put it in the book she was reading and carried it with her for the remainder of the packing. She arrived in Sweetwater Creek on a Tuesday in mid-July, 1882, on the afternoon stage from Prescott. The town was larger than Red Bluff, perhaps 700 people, with a more established quality to its main street, a proper bank and a telegraph office, and a hotel that was somewhat grander than the Bluff House. The stage pulled up in a cloud of dust outside the depot, and she climbed down with her traveling bag and her hat, and Clyde Walden was there. He was in his good shirt, the blue one. He had also polished his boots, she noticed, and had made some effort with his hair that the wind had partially defeated, and he looked at her with that direct, steady gaze that she had come to understand was the face he wore when he was feeling something strongly and had no words adequate to the feeling. "Hello, Ellen," he said. "Hello, Clyde," she said. He took her bag without being asked, and she let him without comment, and they stood for a moment in the July heat on the street outside the depot while Sweetwater Creek went about its business around them. "How was the road?" he asked. "Hot and long and worth it," she said. He smiled, a slow, warm smile that she had seen for the first time on her porch in Red Bluff and that she was already cataloging as one of her favorite things about his face. "The ranch is 12 miles out," he said. "I have the wagon. Ruth and Ben and the children are coming Sunday for supper if that is all right with you. I did not want to overwhelm you with family on the first day." "That is thoughtful," she said. "Domingo and Billy will be at the ranch," he said. "My men." "Domingo is quiet and competent. Billy talks too much but means well. I look forward to meeting them," she said. He handed her up into the wagon with a care that was natural and unsentimental, and not in the least performative. And they drove the 12 miles through the Arizona afternoon with the conversation that was already their particular kind, substantive and easy and comfortable in its silences. The ranch emerged from the desert landscape in the late afternoon, and Ellen saw it first from a low ridge. The house with its stone fireplace visible through the windows, the barn and the corrals, the creek running bright along the north edge of the land, the grazed land spreading out to the south in the late golden light. It was larger than her farm had been and more established, and it had the quality that good ranches have of being embedded in the land rather than imposed on it. "It is fine land," she said. "It is," he agreed, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had worked every inch of it himself. Domingo Torres was in the yard when they arrived, and he nodded to Ellen with a respectful gravity and said that supper was on the stove, which Clyde translated from Domingo's characteristic economy of expression to mean he had prepared something and this was his welcome. Billy Fitch came out of the barn at a near run and was everything Clyde had described, young and eager and full of words, and he shook Ellen's hand with great enthusiasm and told her that Clyde had fixed the broken window and that the spare room was very good now, and that the curtains had just arrived from Mrs. Walden in Prescott. She had a room in the house, the prepared room with its new window and the curtains from Ruth. It was a sensible arrangement, and Clyde had proposed it, and she had agreed to it without discussion, because they were both practical people who understood that propriety had its uses, and also because they were both, in their private hearts, the sort of people who did not rush the important things. Ruth Walden came that Sunday with her husband Ben and their 3 children, and she was, as Clyde had described, warm and direct, and with the same steady quality as her brother, but with an expressiveness that was all her own. She embraced Ellen with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping her brother would find someone for a long time, and was very pleased about this particular outcome. "He wrote to me about your first letter," Ruth told Ellen over the washing up after Sunday supper, while Clyde and Ben sat on the porch and the children ran in the yard. "He said it was the most honest thing he had ever read from a stranger." "I was perhaps too honest," Ellen said. No, Ruth said firmly. You were exactly right. Clyde responds to honest. He has spent 41 years being honest himself and finding very few people willing to return the compliment. She looked at Ellen with the same direct Walden gaze. You are good for him, I can see it already. Ellen was quiet for a moment. I hope so, she said. I intend to be. Ruth smiled. I know, she said. He is good for you too, for what it is worth. I can see that as well. July passed into August, and August had its own particular fire on the Arizona land, and Ellen Abbott settled into the ranch with the same methodical competence she had brought to everything in her life. She took on the kitchen garden, which had been maintained with good intentions but without particular skill, and transformed it within 3 weeks. She took stock of the household management with a practical eye, and reorganized it in ways that Clyde observed and did not interfere with, understanding instinctively that she needed the thing to be hers as well as his. They worked the ranch together in the way that she had imagined when she wrote those first letters side by side, each with their own competence, each honest about the day's work and the day's difficulties. She learned the land with the attentiveness she brought to things she cared about, asking Clyde about the cattle and the water rights and the fence lines, and he answered her with the same attentiveness, never talking down to her, never smoothing the difficult parts. In the evenings they sat on the porch that faced west and watched the sky do what it did out there, and they talked and sometimes did not talk, and the comfort between them deepened from the provisional warmth of new acquaintance into something more durable and more rooted. There were also the harder things, because life without harder things is not life but scenery. In the 3rd week of August, a man arrived at the ranch gate on a dark afternoon when a storm was building to the north. He was well dressed for the territory, which meant that he was not a ranch hand, and he rode a good horse and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who was accustomed to having his presence make an effect. His name was Renfrew. The same Renfrew that Mrs. Marsh had mentioned in Red Bluff, Ellen realized with a cold certainty when he introduced himself. He had followed her interest here. He had come, he said pleasantly, to discuss the Abbott farm in Nevada. He had information that the property was now under a rental agreement and that Mrs. Abbott might be interested in a permanent sale at this point. Ellen stood in the yard and looked at him steadily. I am not interested in a permanent sale, she said. Renfrew smiled the smile of a man who had not yet heard a no that he could not resolve. He said that the offer he had in mind was generous, and that the property was, with respect, not being used to its best advantage. He implied, with the practiced subtlety of a man who had done this many times, that a woman in her situation, the inflection on those words was delicate and deliberate, might want to simplify her holdings. Clyde had come out of the barn during this exchange and was standing at the yard's edge. The lady has answered your question, he said. His voice was entirely calm. There was no heat in it, no posturing. It was simply a statement of fact delivered in a tone that made it entirely clear that the conversation was over. Renfrew looked at him and then back at Ellen with an expression that recalibrated quickly. He said something about leaving his offer open and then turned his horse and rode back down the road. Clyde watched him go. Then he looked at Ellen. Has he been at the Nevada property? He tried to buy it last spring, she said. I refused him then too. Mrs. Marsh thought he was consolidating land south of Red Bluff. He knows you are here now, Clyde said, which means someone in Red Bluff told him, or he has been watching the property. His voice was level, but his expression was thoughtful and serious. I do not think he will cause real trouble. Men like that work through pressure and inconvenience, not through anything more direct. But I want you to know I am going to write to Sutter tomorrow about the rental situation, to make sure it is properly documented and legal. I had already thought of that, Ellen said. He looked at her. I know you had, he said. I was telling you what I intended to do, not telling you what needed doing. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded. Sutter is a good man, I trust him. So do I from what you have said. He paused. Ellen, the farm is yours. Everything about it is your decision. I'm not going to manage it for you. I know that, she said, but I am glad you are here." He looked at her in the way he had of looking at her, direct and quiet and warm. "So am I," he said. They wrote to Sutter together that evening and received a reply within 10 days confirming that the rental agreement was properly registered with the county and that the property was legally well protected. Renfrew did not come back. September arrived, and with it a change in the air that was the Arizona Territory's tentative announcement of autumn. Not the dramatic change of the east, but a softening, a slight easing of the heat's grip, a quality of light that was different in the mornings. Ellen had been at the ranch for nearly 2 months, and it had, somewhere in the middle of those months, become home in the way that places become home, not through time alone, but through the accumulation of small moments. The morning her kitchen garden produced its first proper crop, and Clyde tasted a tomato over the fence and said, "Good God, Ellen, this is remarkable," with an expression of genuine astonishment. The afternoon a calf had gotten tangled in the north fence, and they had worked together for an hour in the failing light to free it without hurting it. And when it ran back to its mother, they had looked at each other with shared satisfaction, and she had laughed and he had smiled. The evening she had been reading on the porch, and he had come out and sat beside her and begun reading from his own book, and they had been silent together for 2 hours with the stars coming out above them, and it had been the most comfortable 2 hours she could remember. In the second week of September, Clyde asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not get down on one knee in the fashion of the novels on her shelf, which would have embarrassed them both. He did it the way he did everything that mattered, directly, in the clear light of the morning at the kitchen table over coffee. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said, because those were the words they used with each other now when the important things were coming. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to since about the 5th day of my visit to Red Bluff, but I did not say it then because I was trying to be patient, and also because I was afraid you would think I was rushing. But I am done being patient about this particular thing. I love you, Ellen. I love the way you look at things and the way you talk and the way you work and the way you are honest even when it would be easier not to be. I want to be married to you, if that is what you want." She looked at him across the table. Her coffee cup was in both her hands and the morning light was on the window behind him, and he was looking at her with everything visible in his face. The hope and the steadiness and the love, all of it right there on the surface without any pretense at all. "Clyde Walden," she said, "it is what I want. It has been what I wanted since approximately the 6th day of your visit when you helped me mend that fence without once suggesting you could do it better than me." He smiled slowly. "I could not have done it better than you," he said. "You were faster." "I know," she said. "You did not say so, though. That was the point." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is emphatically a yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it with a warmth and a steadiness that she had been coming to understand was simply the way that Clyde Walden loved things, not in flashes, not in dramatic declarations, but with the consistency of something that was going to last. They were married in October of 1882 at the Sweetwater Creek Church, in a ceremony that was small and warm and entirely suited to both of them. Ruth and Ben were there with their children. Domingo Torres came in his good shirt and stood in the back and was, for once in his life, visibly moved. Billy Fitch wept openly and without the least embarrassment. Mrs. Cordelia Marsh had made the trip down from Red Bluff, which no one had asked her to do, and which everyone understood was entirely in character. She sat in the front pew and examined the proceedings with the critical attention she brought to everything, and afterward told Clyde that he had done well and told Ellen that she was pleased, and that she expected to be written to regularly, and hugged Ellen again with the same ferocious intensity as at the farewell. Ellen wore a dress of deep blue wool that Ruth had helped her choose in Prescott, and her dark hair with its threads of gray was pinned up simply, and she was, as she had always described herself, plain, and she was also, in the way that the right light on the right face can make anything beautiful, luminous with happiness in a way that Clyde watched all through the ceremony and the small dinner at the ranch house after, as though he still could not entirely believe it was true. He told her so that night. "You are luminous today," he said. She was sitting at the dressing table in what was now their room, unpinning her hair, and she looked at him in the mirror. "I am not a luminous woman," she said. "You are today," he said. "You have been all day." She looked at herself in the mirror and then at his reflection behind her. "I am happy," she said simply. "I think that might be what you are seeing." "It is," he said. "I am seeing you happy. I intend to see it frequently." She set down her hairpin and turned on the stool to look at him directly, not through the glass. "I love you, Clyde," she said. "I want to say it plainly, without the mirror between us, so you have no doubt about it." He came to her and put his hands on her face with a tenderness that was entirely characteristic of the way he touched her, with care and certainty, and no excessive ceremony. "I have no doubt," he said. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was what the ranch hands called a hard one. The cold came early and stayed, and there were 3 storms in January that kept the cattle close to the ranch and required daily attention to feed and water. Clyde and Ellen worked through it together with the same practicality they brought to everything, and the ranch weathered the winter in good order. They also, in the evenings when the cold kept them indoors, continued the conversations they had been having since that first afternoon at the kitchen table in Red Bluff. They read together by the fireplace and debated the books with a cheerful willingness to disagree. They talked about the territory and its politics, the struggles over land and water that were reshaping the West, the increasing presence of the railroads, the ongoing and deeply unjust conflicts with the Apache people that Clyde discussed with a directness and a moral seriousness that Ellen respected enormously. He did not romanticize any of it. He had seen enough of what the expansion of settlement had cost the people who had been here first to have no illusions about the heroism of the enterprise. "It is the great wrong of this time," he said, one evening when the fire was high and the wind was working at the windows. "It will not be undone in our lifetime or in the lifetime of our children, but it should be named." "You say our children," Ellen said carefully. He looked at her. "If that is something we might have." "I am aware," he paused, choosing his words. "I know you made your peace with not having children. I do not want you to feel any pressure in that direction from me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I made my peace with it as a likely fact," she said. "Not as a preference. I am 38 years old and I know what that means in terms of likelihood, but I have not." She stopped. "What?" he said gently. "I have not entirely given up hoping," she said. "Is that foolish?" "No," he said, "it is not." She looked at him. "You would want that children." "I would want whatever you want," he said. "A child would be," he considered it honestly in the way he considered everything. "It would be a remarkable thing." She took his hand across the space between their chairs, the way he had taken hers on her porch in Nevada that first night. "Then we will hope," she said. Spring came to the ranch in March with its particular desert intensity, the brief green surge, the wildflowers on the south hillside that Ellen discovered one morning on her ride, and came back to describe to Clyde with more animation than she usually brought to description, having clearly been somewhat overwhelmed by them. He saddled his horse and rode out to see them and agreed that they were remarkable and made a note of the location so they could ride out together the following year. He also, in March, dealt with a small crisis with the water rights on the north section of the property. A neighboring rancher named Garrett had begun diverting a portion of the creek upstream, which reduced the flow through the Walden Ranch's north pasture. This was a legal matter and a practical one, and Clyde handled it through the territory's legal system with the same methodical patience he brought to problems he could not resolve by physical work alone. It took 6 weeks and a trip to the county seat and some cost, but it was resolved in the ranch's favor, and the creek ran as it should run, and the north pasture was saved from the dry summer that would otherwise have followed. Ellen had helped prepare the legal documentation, which involved a fair amount of writing and research, and had proved to be better at both than Clyde, which he acknowledged without difficulty. "You are better with words than I am," he said. "You are better with cattle than I am," she said. "We are well matched in aggregate." He smiled at her across the kitchen table where the paperwork was spread out. "We are," he said, "in aggregate and in particular." By the summer of 1883, the ranch was running well, and the household was fully shared in the way that it had been from the beginning, practically and equitably, with a division of labor that was based on competence and inclination rather than convention. Ellen's kitchen garden had expanded, and now supplied not only the house but a small regular sale to the hotel in Sweetwater Creek, which was a source of both income and considerable satisfaction to her. She had also, quietly and without making a great deal of it, been corresponding with an Eastern newspaper about a series of articles she was writing about life on the Territory Ranch, the daily reality of it, the work and the landscape and the people. The editor had expressed interest and she had sent 3 pieces, and in August came the news that all 3 would be published and that the editor wanted more. She told Clyde over supper. He put down his fork and looked at her. "Ellen," he said. "That is extraordinary." She colored slightly. "It is only 3 articles," she said. "It is 3 articles in an Eastern newspaper," he said. "Written by a woman who did not tell her husband she was doing it. Why did you not tell me?" She looked at her plate. "I was not certain it would come to anything," she said. "And I did not want—" She stopped. "What?" "I did not want to say it out loud and then have it not happen," she said. "That felt too exposing." He was quiet for a moment, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression of great tenderness. "You are allowed to want things out loud in this house," he said. "Even things that might not come to anything. You are allowed to tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know that," she said. "I am still learning it." "We have time," he said. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me for that," he said. "And I want to read the articles." She brought them to him after supper, and he read them by the firelight with a care and attention that she watched from the other chair, and when he finished the 3rd one he looked up and said, "You write the land as well as anyone I have ever read, better than most." "You have not read many writers about the land," she said. "I have read you," he said. "That is enough comparison." In October of 1883, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding, Ellen told Clyde that she believed she was with child. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table, which was where they always told each other the important things. Her voice was steady and her eyes were direct, and she was holding her coffee cup in both hands in the way she did when she was nervous. He was very still for a moment. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Reasonably certain," she said. "I will be more certain in another month, but I am reasonably certain." He stood up from the table and came around it to her and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and looked up at her face with an expression she had never seen on him before, wholly open, wholly unguarded, everything at once, hope and wonder and a love so clear and unadorned that it stopped her breath. "Ellen," he said, her name in his mouth like it was the word he had been looking for all his life. She put one hand to his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm for a moment, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying. Dr. Henniker in Sweetwater Creek confirmed the pregnancy in November and pronounced Ellen in good health. He was a straightforward man who did not condescend and gave her honest information about what to expect, and Clyde sat through the consultation with the attentive seriousness of a man who was going to remember every word. They wrote to Ruth and Ben, who responded with a letter of such exuberant joy that Ellen laughed when she read it, and then folded it carefully and put it in her desk. They wrote to Mrs. Cordelia Marsh in Red Bluff, who replied that this was excellent news and that she expected to be informed the moment the child arrived, and that she was already considering what to send. Ellen continued working through the pregnancy with the practicality that was her deepest nature, managing the kitchen garden, writing her articles, managing the household, riding in the early months before the doctor advised otherwise. She was, as she had been all her life, neither dramatic about her difficulties nor dismissive of them. When she was tired, she said so. When she was uncomfortable, she said so. She and Clyde talked about the pregnancy with the same honesty they brought to everything, which meant that the particular fears of a woman 38 years old carrying her first child, were acknowledged and discussed rather than suppressed. "I am afraid," she said to him, one evening in January when the cold was sharp and the firelight was warm and she was at the stage where the child's movements were unmistakable and constant. "Of the birth?" he asked. "Of all of it," she said. "Of the birth, yes, but also what if I am not good at it? What if I do not know what I am doing?" He looked at her with steadiness and love. "You are the most competent person I have ever met," he said. "You will not know everything. No one does. But you will learn it, and I will be here and we will figure it out together." "You are also not going to know what you are doing," she noted. "No," he said, "not at all, but I expect we will manage." She leaned against him on the settee, which was not something she did often. She was not by nature a person who leaned, and he put his arm around her and they sat by the fire. "I did not think this was going to be my life," she said quietly. "A year ago I thought my life was essentially determined, fixed, that what I had was what I would have." "And now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Now I think I was wrong about what was possible," she said, "and I am very glad I was wrong." He pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The child was born in April of 1884, on a clear morning with a sharp spring light and the smell of the desert waking up outside the window. It was a boy, 7 pounds and certain about his opinions from the first minute, and the doctor declared both mother and child in excellent health. Clyde was in the house throughout the birth, which was not always the custom, but which was what Ellen wanted and what he intended regardless of custom. He held her hand through the hardest hours and was steady in the way that he was always steady, present without pretending that nothing was difficult, honest without being frightening. When the doctor put the child in Ellen's arms, she was exhausted and flushed, and her hair was loose, and she looked up at Clyde with an expression he had never seen on anyone's face before, a look of such unguarded wonder, such complete presence in the moment, that he felt it physically in his chest. "He is real," she said, which was perhaps not the most obvious observation, but which was entirely characteristic of Ellen Abbott Walden, who had always required things to be real. "He is extremely real," the doctor agreed, already packing his bag. They named him James, for no reason more complicated than that they both liked it, and also Thomas, for Ellen's brother in Ohio, as a middle name, a kindness that made Thomas cry when he was told, which Ellen reported to Clyde with a mixture of amusement and genuine emotion. Ruth and Ben came within the week, and the children descended on the ranch with their full complement of noise and enthusiasm, and examined the baby with the seriousness that children bring to the examination of new things. Ruth held James with the ease of a woman who had done it 3 times before, and told Ellen she had done magnificently, and Ellen said she was not certain magnificently was the word she would have chosen, and Ruth said sometimes the most extraordinary things happen to people who insist on underestimating themselves. Domingo Torres looked at the child from a respectful distance and said that he had good hands, which from Domingo was a significant compliment. Billy Fitch held him with the terrified care of a young man encountering an infant for the first time, and declared him the finest baby in the territory, which was an overstatement but an endearing one. Mrs. Cordelia Marsh sent a package from Red Bluff containing a hand-sewn quilt in a pattern Ellen recognized from the older woman's own parlor, and a letter that was 3 paragraphs of practical advice and 1 paragraph of what was, unmistakably, love, not stated as such, but entirely present in the warmth between the lines of a woman who was not much given to stating things plainly when she could convey them obliquely instead. Ellen wrote back a proper letter that conveyed, in its own way, the same thing. The spring moved through summer and into the fall that followed, and James grew with the determination of something that had decided very early on that the world was interesting, and that he intended to investigate all of it. He was brown from the sun by the time he was walking, sturdily crossing the yard with the focused intensity of a person on an important errand, and Clyde watched him from the porch in the evenings with a quiet astonishment that never entirely faded. He told Ellen that the astonishment did not fade. "Is it what you expected?" she asked. They were on the porch in the fall evening, James asleep inside. "I did not know what to expect," Clyde said honestly. "I had no model for it. But it is the most unexpected thing that has happened in a life that has had several unexpected things recently." She looked at him with the warmth that had grown between them over the years without diminishing, had in fact continued to grow, adding to itself with each thing they came through together, each difficulty resolved, each ordinary evening that was not ordinary at all. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her in the fall light. This woman who had written a letter of such extraordinary honesty that he had saddled a horse before he finished reading it. This woman who was plain and real and present and more alive to him than anyone he had ever known. This woman who was the mother of his child and his partner in the work and his companion in the evenings and his truest friend. "Ellen," he said, "I'm the happiest man in the territory." She laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that was still one of his favorite sounds. "That is a modest claim," she said. "The territory is large." "In the West, then," he said. "I am the happiest man in the West." "Better," she said, and leaned against him on the porch bench the way she had leaned against him that winter evening, easy and warm, and he put his arm around her and they watched the sky do what it always did in the evenings out there, turning the desert into something so beautiful it seemed almost unreal. But it was real. All of it. The ranch, the creek, the garden, the kitchen table where the important conversations happened. James asleep inside and the lamp lit in the window. Domingo in his house at the property's edge and Billy Fitch in the bunkhouse, likely talking even in his sleep. Mrs. Marsh in Red Bluff with her jar of preserves and her sharp eyes and her ferocious loyalty. Ruth and Ben and their children 20 miles away in Prescott. The Nevada farm still quietly standing under Sutter's reliable management, held not because it was needed, but because it had been part of Ellen's life, and she was not ready to let it go entirely, and Clyde had never asked her to. The letter on the table that he had read 3 paragraphs of before he got up and saddled his horse. "Tired down to my bones." He was not tired anymore. He had not been tired in that way since the afternoon he read those words, and recognized in them something true about his own tiredness, and had understood that the right answer to both their exhaustions was to move toward them rather than away. "What are you thinking about?" Ellen asked without moving from her position against his side. "Your first letter," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The honest one," he said. "I think about it sometimes too," she said. "I think about how frightened I was when I sent it. I sat at the post office for a very long time." "I know," he said. "You told me. And I think," she continued, "that it was the best thing I ever did. Not because of how it turned out, though I am extremely pleased with how it turned out, but because it was the first time in a very long time that I had been completely honest about what I actually was and what I actually wanted. And I think," she paused, "I think that was the beginning of getting back to myself. After all those years of performing the expected version." He held her a little closer. "I think you were always yourself," he said. "You just did not have the circumstances to show it." "That is generous," she said. "It is accurate," he said. She was quiet for a moment and then, "I'm not tired anymore either," she said, "in case you were wondering." He smiled against her hair. "I was not wondering," he said. "But I am glad." The evening deepened and the stars came out, and from inside the house the small sounds of a sleeping child made themselves known, a brief murmur, a settling. Ellen shifted slightly and said she ought to check on James, and he let her go and watched her move through the rectangle of lamplight from the window into the house, capable and unhurried and entirely herself. He sat on the porch alone for a few more minutes, listening to the creek and the night sounds and the ranch settling into the dark. He thought about the future, the articles Ellen was writing, which were beginning to draw a readership, and the letter that had arrived last month from an Eastern publisher who wanted to know whether she had ever considered writing something longer than newspaper pieces. He thought about James walking in the yard with his focused determination, and what he would be in 10 years, in 20. He thought about the ranch in summer and in winter, the work of it and the beauty of it, and about Domingo Torres' certain competence and Billy Fitch's incorrigible enthusiasm, and about Ruth and Ben's children who would grow up knowing James as a cousin. He thought about Ellen. He thought about her the way that he thought about the land, with a deep, settled awareness of its permanence, of the fact that it was his, and he was bound to it, and that the binding was not a limitation but a gift of the highest order. He had been lonely for a long time without knowing fully how lonely he was. He had known it in the way that you know a color that has always been there, present but unremarked, part of the fabric of ordinary days. And then Ellen Abbott had written a letter and the color had changed. He heard her voice inside, murmuring softly to James, the particular low tone she used with the child that he had not known she possessed, until he heard it for the first time and had felt something move in him that had no name and did not need one. He stood up from the porch bench and went inside. She was in the rocking chair by the window with James on her lap, not awake, just fussing in his sleep, and she was rocking him with one hand and had the other resting on the arm of the chair, and she looked up when Clyde came in with the steady, warm look that was entirely hers. He sat across from her and watched them for a moment in the lamplight. "He is almost back to sleep," she said quietly. "There is no hurry," he said. She looked down at the child and then back up at him. "Clyde," she said. "Yes." "I want to write to Mrs. Marsh tomorrow and invite her to visit," she said. "She has not seen James and she is not getting younger and I miss her." "Write to her," he said. "Invite her for as long as she wants to stay. She can have the spare room." Ellen smiled, that warm, full smile that had started as the antechamber of itself on a June afternoon in a kitchen garden in Nevada, and had become, over these years, entirely unrestrained and entirely beautiful. "She will reorganize the kitchen," she said. "Let her," he said. "She will have opinions about Billy Fitch," she said. "Everyone has opinions about Billy Fitch," he said. She laughed softly, mindful of the sleeping child, and James stirred and settled, and the lamp flickered in a current of air from the window. Clyde looked at his wife and his son in the lamplight, and the room around them that was a home, genuinely and fully a home, the kind that is built not from lumber and plaster, but from honesty and shared work, and the patient daily accumulation of love. He thought of a woman writing a letter at a table somewhere in Nevada, 38 years old and plain and tired of pretending, and the courage it had taken to send it. He thought of himself reading 3 paragraphs and getting up from his chair and going outside, and the horse waiting at the hitching post, and the fence line in the spring morning light, and the certainty that had moved in him, even then like the first current of a river finding its course. James was asleep. Ellen set him carefully in his cradle and straightened and stretched, and came to sit beside Clyde on the settee with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her own life. "What are you thinking?" she asked. It was becoming one of their questions. "About the letter," he said. She looked at him. "Again, I think I will be thinking about that letter for the rest of my life," he said. "Not in a complicated way, just I think about what almost did not happen. I think about you sitting at that post office window with it in your hand." She was quiet for a moment. "I put it in," she said. "That is the important part." "You put it in," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you wrote back," she said. "And I wrote back," he said. "And then I saddled my horse." She laughed, a small, warm sound. "You were ridiculous," she said affectionately. "I was," he said. "Entirely." Outside the ranch house, the Arizona night was enormous and full of stars, and the creek ran its reliable course along the north edge of the land, and the kitchen garden was waiting for morning, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and the world was, for the space of that moment and for all the moments that were coming, exactly what it needed to be. Sufficient. More than sufficient. Real.